This is Mike Tatarski, host of the Vietnam Weekly podcast, coming to you from Ho Chi Minh City. In 2023, Vietnam welcomed about 12.6 million international tourists. It aims to hit 18 million this year, a figure that would bring the industry back to pre-pandemic levels. Through the first quarter of this year, official statistics put Vietnam at just over 6 million foreign tourists and over 40 million domestic tourists, bringing in almost $11 billion in revenue. That puts the country on pace to easily beat its targets, though arrivals data isn't considered particularly accurate. Nonetheless, some destinations are certainly busy, and national holidays continue to see huge crowds in certain areas. The travel behavior has shifted this year due to high domestic airfares and the opening of new highways. Vietnam's long-term tourism goals are to continue growth in these figures, and the country is far behind regional peers like Thailand, with over 28 million international arrivals in 2023, and Malaysia, which had about 20 million arrivals last year. But what is the cost of these goals? Popular beaches across the country are awash in trash, while tourism development has wiped out forests and natural areas elsewhere. Phu Quoc and Sapa are especially egregious examples of tourism gone wrong, but they aren't alone. Given the damage that has already been done, can Vietnam tourism move on to a more sustainable path? Today's guest is Nuno Ribeiro, Senior Lecturer in Tourism and Hospitality Management at RMIT University, Vietnam. We discuss the importance of sustainable tourism development, Vietnam's relatively recent tourism history, the importance of a qualified workforce for sustainable tourism and Vietnam's sharp shortage in this area, factors driving the country's dismal visitor return rate, and the understated economic impact of tourism. This is the first in a two-part series on sustainable tourism. Next week's episode will focus entirely on Phu Quoc with Stuart McDonald of Travelfish. As always, if you have any comments, feedback, or guest suggestions, get in touch at matatarski@gmail.com. Let's get to my conversation with Nuno. Nuno, thanks so much for joining the podcast.
Hi, Mike. A pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Of course. So excited to talk about this topic today. It's one I've covered here and there in the newsletter, but pretty important, I think, overall, sustainable
Absolutely.
travel or sustainable tourism, more accurately, which, kind of in your view, what does it mean for tourism to develop sustainably?
Let me start by giving you the academic answer. So sustainable tourism development is tourism development that meets the needs of the current generation without jeopardizing the needs of future generations. So basically, we develop tourism in such a way as it meets the needs, and these needs can be economic, social, cultural, of the present, taking into consideration that in a lengthier timeline, say 2 years from now, 5 years from now, 10, 20, 30 years from now, we don't want to jeopardize the possibility of future generations using tourism resources. What does that mean concretely? First, that there is a timeline, right? That much like Vietnam has done, we decide whether or not tourism development is going to be critical for the development of the country. We have already done that. Number two, we have a legal framework in which to encompass sustainable tourism development. Vietnam has also done that. In 2017, it's one of the first countries in Southeast Asia to have a legal definition of tourism that forcibly includes sustainable tourism development. And then the much more difficult part is the operational plan. What do we do right now that allows for sustainable development? In some areas, we're doing remarkably well. In others, we still have a little bit of work to do. And I'm sure in our conversation today, we'll explore those areas a little bit more.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks. That's a concise definition. And you also mentioned when we were kind of setting this up that Vietnam's tourism history is a relatively recent or new one.
Very recent.
So before we dive deeper on sustainability, what is kind of the brief overview of tourism here?
It's a fascinating story. It has to do with a book, actually, Mike. And I'm not sure if you're a fan of guidebooks or not. I tend to collect them. If by any chance you come across a 1992 edition of Lonely Planet Vietnam, and it's a first edition, you scoop that puppy up because it's worth 10, 20 grand.
Okay.
And that has something to do with tourism history. So I'm going to try and be as brief as I can. As you know, tourism in Vietnam really starts in 1986 with Doi Mui and the renovation period when Vietnam opens its economy to the outside world, starts a transition to a transitional market economy. Between 1986 and the early 90s, we have the early explorers, right? So basically, Vietnam opens to tourism. You have the first backpackers, the first explorers, some Chinese tourists, but really the numbers aren't very large.
Mm-hmm.
In 1991, a little guidebook from what was going to be the Lonely Planet Company comes out, and that's traveling on a shoestring in Southeast Asia. And Vietnam is a chapter. And for some reason, there's a little blip in the number of international arrivals from countries like the United Kingdom, France, until 1992, the following year, when it's so popular that they devote its own guidebook and it just explodes. Until 1995, when Vietnam joins ASEAN. And a condition of Vietnam joining ASEAN was that Vietnam should liberalize its domestic aviation industry, allowing international air carriers to operate in Vietnam. And that's when tourism really takes off. And it's one of the most remarkable success stories because it literally grows by 10, 15, 20% year on year until we get to the early 2000s where it really booms, right? We start to get into the millions. And let's sort of keep in mind that Vietnam as a population is just shy of 100 million. In our highest year for tourism, we had 18 million in 2019. Then, of course, we have COVID. And now we are in 2024 and tourism is rebooming, if I may use the expression. And I have no doubt we'll achieve 18 million this year and it will grow fast. I'm not sure the average person realizes how fast things can grow, but Vietnam will grow exponentially very, very quickly. And that's one of my concerns as an academic, as someone who has an interest in Vietnam tourism, is this perpetual question that we debate in the industry. Are we ready for this? What happens if in 2025, instead of 18 million, we have 20 or we have 25? What happens if in 5 years we have 30 million? Because that's what happened in similar countries. But again, sort of to underline the point, Mike, it's a very recent industry. It's maybe 30 years old, 30 to 40. When we compare that with similar destinations like Thailand, Malaysia, India, we're very, very new, very, very recent. But a fascinating industry. And again, Mike, if you find a copy of that guidebook, man, you keep it.
Okay. Yeah, I'd be fascinated to see what was in it even.
It's a love letter to Vietnam. You can find, I think, some facsimile, some copies of the original editions, and the writing is magnificent, right? They didn't get professional writers. They got basically expats that have been living in Southeast Asia for a long time, and it's beautiful to read. Anyhow, that's a little side note.
Yeah. Well, listeners should keep an eye out. Anyway, I mean, we'll get into more about how that explosive growth, of course, has had some impacts, to say the least, in some destinations, I think. But when it comes to sustainable tourism, what kind of approach do you see from stakeholders in the industry here in Vietnam?
I think the general feeling is that it's not just desirable, it's a necessity. And that's driven by two different areas towards a common goal. First and foremost, it's demand driven, right? The current generations who are traveling, they demand that of businesses, right? They will not pick areas, they will not pick destinations if they feel they're having a negative impact on the environment. And more, we're seeing that choice. They will pick a hotel, even if it's a little bit more expensive, but they advertise sustainable business practices. So there is this pressure from demand that obviously businesses are trying to correspond. And that's where you will see international business operators, the large hotel chains, the large tour operators, the airlines, they're corresponding to this. And so they're sort of putting pressure to have sustainable tourism development. On the other hand, you have some pressure from civil society and from government because they realize they've looked at other countries. We've had negative experiences with very fast tourism development and look, we have to develop this. At the same time, the rate at which tourism grows in Vietnam, and we're going to sort of make a parenthesis in COVID and maybe save that for another conversation. It is so quick and so fast and so new for Vietnam as a country that's difficult to keep up. So again, I would say there is a lot of goodwill. There's a lot of understanding that it is absolutely critical to develop tourism sustainably. We still have a way to go in some areas.
And I mean, how much concern might there be? So you've said how Vietnam's tourism here is relatively new, international tourism, especially, but even in that short amount of time period, I mean,
there is a huge amount of concern. right?
But I'll name a couple destinations, Phu
Sure.
Quoc, Sapa, for example,
Yep.
which clearly have kind of the poster
Yep.
children for some of the unsustainable
Bingo.
development. So how much concern do you have about that?
Huge.
Mm,
Had a few more. Hoi An, Con Dao, hey, where we live, Saigon, right?
mm,
They are perpetual concerns for everyone in all areas of tourism development. I'll give you an example, right? Phu Quoc 25 years ago was a little more than a fishing village that was visited by locals, and look at its development now. So there is an enormous amount of concern because we don't want to be, say, what Santorini is, right? Which
mm,
is a mass tourism destination. We don't want to be another Barcelona. I'm sure you've been following the international news where there's been a huge movement against over tourism in
yeah.
numerous European capitals. We don't want to get to that point, right? And so there is a lot of concern. And especially because Vietnam tourism has sort of as its pillars nature-based and culture-based tourism, right? Obviously, the food, which is a little side note, but primarily people visit Vietnam because it's a beautiful country, has remarkable nature formations that cannot be found anywhere else. I'm thinking of
Mm,
Ha Long Bay, for example, is quintessential example, and a lot of concern with sustainable tourism development there. I'm thinking of Hoi An. You have anywhere from Cham, Khmer, vestiges of civilizations that are long gone, that are unique in the world. Now,
mm,
what happens if we don't develop tourism sustainably? These are overrun, right? And all of a sudden, we go back to our original definition of sustainable tourism development, and they may not be here. These
mm,
resources may not be here in 2 or 3 generations' time. I'll give you another example. The national parks of Vietnam, the cave systems that were recently discovered, the largest cave system in the world. If we do not have regulations in place, if we do not have very strict tourism development regulations in place, it's not going to be here. It's as simple as that, right? And
mm.
so there is a lot of concern um, from all parties involved. Now, the challenging bit is how do we go about doing it, and how do we do it in such a way that it does not hamper tourism development?
Mm.
That's very tricky to do, and Mike, I've been studying tourism, studying and teaching it for more than, I don't know, 20 years. I don't have a silver bullet. I don't think no one does, right? It's very destination based. But yeah, there is a lot of concern.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned the caves. Phong
Mhm.
Nha, Ke Bang National Park, which I should point out is like I'm I think a good positive for Vietnam tourism right now. I've actually been
Absolutely.
kind of shocked by how well preserved they've kept it.
Absolutely.
There's no mega projects. Of course, there was the controversy about a cable car proposal, but that got shelved. So it seems like it can be done. But then you look at
Absolutely, it can.
other
It
places.
is. It is difficult. Absolutely, it can be done. It needs the political will. It needs the business acumen, and it needs, I think, most importantly, a desire by civil society to decide. No, no, no. We want to develop this area sustainably. We don't want
Mm,
mass tourism, right? That's difficult. Absolutely, it can be done. I'll remind you as well. Hoi An was the very first place in Vietnam to have a sustainable tourism development plan that was financially supported by UNESCO, right,
mm,
which is remarkable.
mm,
Um, so it can be done, absolutely. And there are plenty of success stories for us to draw inspiration from. But,
mm.
it's a very large country, and we don't always have the resources to develop as we would like it to. We're working that.
And one of those resources, which you really highlighted for me when we
Mm,
were planning this conversation, is human resources. So,
mm.
people to work in the industry, especially focused on sustainability. How important are qualified human
I'd
resources?
say they are the most important, Mike. They are critical. And they are perhaps the perennial issue that we have been struggling in Vietnam for the last 20 to 25 years. Let me give you some numbers just to sort of put it into context.
Mm,
So, assuming pre COVID 2024 levels, meaning levels of tourism development that are between 16 to 18 million international tourists and 110, 120 domestic tourists. Something that sometimes gets lost in the conversation, right? The international tourists, yes, there are many, but there are a lot more domestic tourists, and they also cause
of
pressure in the
course.
tourism ecosystem. So we need about 30 to 40,000 qualified professionals every year. So, Mike, this is a minimum of 2 years training in tourism and hospitality. And when I say training, it's anywhere between vocational training, remedial education for someone who's been in the industry for a long time, 2 years post high school associate's degree, 2 years university education. We need between 30 to 40,000. at best, we produce 10,000. So that begs the question. So where do the others come from? Right? Because we have full employment in the tourism and hospitality industry in Vietnam. Well, they come from other areas without the training. What happens then? They're not necessarily trained in sustainable tourism development. They're not necessarily trained in service quality. And that's going to decrease the service quality of the services that we deliver. That's not going to have such an impact on the development of sustainable tourist practices. We have a huge issue with cadres at the middle and upper management level in tourism and hospitality. The way we've been dealing with that is we import them, right? We hire a lot of foreign professionals with the hope that they will train the next generation of tourism professionals. Here in Vietnam, that's homegrown. But again, we only produce 10,000. We need 40,000. And very soon, we're going to need 50, and then 60, 100,000, right? So that's an issue for us to debate. And I think I'd be a poor educator if I didn't launch the challenge. Please develop more universities, have partnerships between industry and higher education, have remedial vocational training post high school. We have so many talented young people in Vietnam. Please direct them towards the tourism and hospitality industry because we're going to need them. And we're going to need them very soon.
Yeah, and I will say I do, when I travel here, occasionally run, at hotels or resorts, meet some really unbelievably sharp Vietnamese
very sharp,
staff
very
members.
keen, very hardworking. I shout out to my students. It's been I've been an educator in 3 continents, 5 countries. My Vietnamese students are the best. But again, they need the training, right? They need the education. And same goes for everyone else who works in the industry.
So given that, and I mean, you've already highlighted a couple destinations that have concerns. What is kind of your realistic assessment of sustainability in the tourism sector? I realize that's a very broad question, but
Mike, that's a tough question.
Yeah.
As realistically and as candid as I can be with you, I think we need to have an urgent conversation between all stakeholders and decide what type of tourism do we want for Vietnam. We have the legal framework. We have a strategic plan that's until 2030. But we need to decide, and very soon, do we want mass tourism or not? Which that is an option, right? That is an option. And there's a reason why countries have mass tourism. Well, it brings in enormous financial resources to any country. And some countries have made that option. Do we want a specialized type of tourism? Do we want some preferred destinations to visit Vietnam versus others? Until we have that conversation and until we all agree on a sort of path to follow, and of course we address the pollution issue, I think we will have very tentative steps towards sustainable tourism development. We're going to have, certainly, as you mentioned, a few success stories for sure. Absolutely. And again, kudos to all of those involved, both public and private. But until we decide as a country where we want to go as a sustainable tourism destination, I think it will be difficult, right? One of the greatest challenges that we face is the administrative bureaucracy that even with all the utmost goodwill in the world from all parties involved, it's still very difficult, right? And so we're trying the best that we can to advise in the sense that we need to reduce that bureaucracy, right? To sort of streamline these processes. So realistically, I think we are on the right track. I think we need to have a public civil discourse on what we want to be in the future and how we want to get there. And I think we need to prepare very, very soon. I think I'm utmost convinced that 2024 is the year of the re-explosion of Vietnam tourism. And I think it will grow if the World Tourism Organization, the World Travel and Tourism Council, along with the World Bank, their projections are, in the 2-digit, in some cases, close to 20% growth year on year. We need to get ready very, very soon.
Building on that, I'm curious. Do you think Vietnam has any tourism identity? Because I notice a lot in kind of domestic media that they compare themselves to Thailand a lot, which of course Thailand is a world-class destination. It's a lovely place to visit, but I find it a bit odd that they kind of seems like they want to just be Thailand, which obviously it's Vietnam.
Absolutely. I'm not sure that's correct. I think, yes, you do see that in the news every now and again. I don't think we should be Thailand. I would not like us to be Thailand, but I don't want to pursue the current image that's portrayed in the media, especially on social media in regard to Vietnam, which is a very cheap destination. I don't want us to be a cheap destination. I don't want any more backpackers. We got plenty. I don't want, how to live in Saigon for $1 a day. You know what? Thanks. Why don't you go visit somewhere else? We do have an identity that's based on tourism-based and culture-based products. We have not been the best at advertising it. And one of the reasons why I think you will see a lot of articles comparing us trying to get on the Thailand bandwagon is because it's an easy way to promote, right? So Vietnam is considered, especially for long-haul travelers, a one-in-a-lifetime destination. So it's very common for someone who's going to Thailand for the first time, or Laos or Cambodia, to also visit Vietnam. And so from a promotional standpoint, it makes sense. But again, in my professional opinion, we should not be Thailand. We're not Thailand, right? Thailand developed tourism in a very different way from what we have. I think we should have our own identity, again, based on nature and cultural-based attractions, and have an identity based on an incredibly rich array of tourism resources that are different from those in Thailand. Again, I think that for us here in Vietnam, we do have something to correct in regard to our image. I'm not sure if you've done this exercise, but if you go on YouTube and put in Vietnam tourism, I don't like the first 10 or 15 videos. They're not necessarily the type of image I would like Vietnam to be portrayed at to the outside world, outside of Vietnam. And I think we have a lot of work to correct those.
Yeah, I will say I don't go on YouTube much, but I do spend time on Reddit and the Vietnam subreddit. I swear half the posts are people complaining about being scammed or cheated out of something or charged more, which as somebody who lives here, I find, because I feel I don't have these experiences on a monthly, either, let alone daily basis. But these posts are getting a lot of attention from people considering.
And absolutely they do. I'm a fan of that subreddit as well, Mike. We should be reminded that social media tends to polarize extreme experiences, right?
Of course.
Obviously, they're going to give a sort of an echo chamber to the worst experiences that are going to draw a lot more viewers due to their algorithm versus something. Oh, I had a wonderful time in Vietnam. Oh, that's great. But there is something a little bit of concern because that does touch on service quality that we talked about a little earlier. We do have a huge barrier in regard to international tourists and misunderstanding, which is the language, right? It's a tonal language. It is, I'm sure, as you know, difficult to learn.
Very.
So if you are a tourist coming to Vietnam from a Western country, perhaps with a Latin or Germanic-based linguistic root, it's going to be very difficult for you to understand. At the same time, add cultural mores in some areas that you may think that someone is trying to play a trick on you, when in reality, it's just common. It's what people do. When I go on the weekend, when I go buy groceries at my local market, I have some nice banter with the potato lady, and she tries to take one potato and I take one, but I know the price, and I'll ask the price. Now, if you have one or two tours to have those bad experiences, we should probably look into that. Especially if it's something that happens on a routine basis, and perhaps we can do work on two fronts. One, on the supply side, again, we need more qualified professionals, and two, on the demand side, perhaps have some short introductory culture videos to Vietnam, the do's and don'ts. I've seen so many bad videos online. I'm sure we can produce something better, right? Perhaps on the flight, on the way over, on the train. If someone is traveling by train, on the bus, hey, watch this 5-10 minute video. And I think that would avoid a lot of misunderstandings.
Yeah, I mean, in case any listeners think this is just, it's just people complaining on social media. I mean, there is, so Thailand, I guess we can keep using that as a comparison, is well known as a place people will go to over and over again for vacation, whereas Vietnam kind of infamously has this like 5% return rate.
4.7%. Yeah, okay. Exactly.
Which is quite poor, I think.
Very poor.
So we've talked about some of the factors potentially behind this, but what are some other issues you think that may be driving that?
That's been a perennial thorn in my side, Mike. We've been at 4% for a long time. Currently, we're standing at 4.7%. When we compare that with Thailand, which is 32%, Malaysia is in the 20s. India is, please don't quote me on this, I want to say 24, 25. A few reasons for this. The number one reason is service quality. And here, I have to be honest, we don't have the best tourism service quality in the world. And it's not out of lack of goodwill. It's not lack of trying. We simply do not have the qualified human resources in the quantities that we need. We just don't. Then we have some challenges in regard to the language, in regard to the travel time that it takes to get to Vietnam. We're still considered, for most Western countries, most Western international tourists, we're a once-in-a-lifetime destination. And so we're sort of coupled with other countries that may have had more experience developing tourism that we have not had. And so when you compare them, we more often than not, we come out not the winner. Also, we have some administrative bureaucracies that, we're trying really, really hard to overcome. And then we have some quagmires that we should really look into. For example, arrival at the airports is still tiresome, as you know.
Yep.
It's still burdensome. Imagine if you're a family with children arriving and you have to queue in line for a couple of hours. It's not going to be fun, right? And if that's your first impression and your last impression, then you may see why that return visit rate is not as high. And then on a more structural side, we have not started developing intermodal transportation until very recently. It's been the last 5 to 10 years, right? So having a railway and motorway system directly tied to tourism and tied to development of airport transportation is very new, right? The newest expressway, the Phan Thiet, just opened last year. The metro in Saigon opened this year. So we still have some work to do in regard to integrating different modes of transportation. But again, we're getting there. And I think that once we do solve these issues, you'll see that return rate climb. But again, the number one factor for all of this is human resources.
I know. I mean, you mentioned the airport. It is unfortunate. And I know they're building a new one for Ho Chi Minh City. Are. There might be some issues actually getting there because it's a bit far away. But certainly if you compare flying into Bangkok, KL, let alone Singapore, that's a whole other level. But the airport
experience... It's a very different experience. I think maybe clarify for your listeners, it's not that people aren't trying to do so, but let me just give you an example. So for example, in the case of the airport, there are 7 administrative departments in charge of tourist arrivals in Tan Son Nhat. 7. And I have a hard time in a faculty meeting getting 2 or 3 people to agree, let alone 7 different departments. That goes back sort of to our point on administrative bureaucracy, right? That's still very heavy in Vietnam, and with good reason. It's a choice as a society. But these things are being done very slowly. I have to say that the last time I flew through Tan Son Nhat, I did see some progress. It was substantially faster than last time, so let's hope that they continue.
Yeah, I flew back recently from Singapore, and though it was a long line, it did move. I mean, they at least had every counter open, which sometimes in the past was not the case. So maybe that is an improvement, but we'll see.
We'll see. Yeah.
But let's say...
I saw some electronic gates as well being implemented, so let's hope that they can use those.
Yeah, that seems like they're figuring it out, but I've heard mixed reactions. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. But let's say people are listening, maybe they live in Vietnam or they're thinking of visiting. I'm not sure if you can name specific properties in the country, but if they wanted to go somewhere a bit more sustainable, like let's say a general destination. I mean, we mentioned Phog Nha, but where would you kind of recommend people look?
I'm biased, right? I still think that Con Dao is one of the most beautiful places you can go to. There are a few, and again, I'm not supported financially by any of these companies, but the Accor Group has been doing really well. The Annam Group has been doing really well in having sustainable tourism destinations. I still think that Hoi An is worth the visit. And lately, I'm not sure if you saw in the news, but Van Don Island has banned single-use plastics, which is sort of the bane of our holidays, right? We are one of the foremost producers of plastics in the world, right, which really is not pretty. But I would please go visit those islands. I still think that Phu Quoc is worth a visit. There are areas of Phu Quoc, there's some hidden gems that are still very, very pretty. And I would encourage tourists to come even to those areas that are not necessarily the most pristine, because I think that drive from international tourists, while we may not like it in the short run, right? No one likes it's dirty or it's very polluted. that may spur a lot of activity towards sustainable tourism development.
And so you also mentioned when we were talking before the call about kind of the potentially underestimated economic impact of tourism. And I have seen sometimes, on social media, for example, if tourism's having a bad stretch or something, people will be like, "Oh, who cares? That's not that important for the economy anyway."
They
But
should care.
I get the sense you disagree with that.
I vehemently disagree with it. So the official numbers that we have for percentage of Vietnam's GDP is between 9 and 11%. The World Bank seems to think it's between 12 and 13%. World Tourism Organization, World Travel and Tourism Council think it's much higher, around 14 to 15%. I personally think, along with my colleagues who are experts in tourism economics, is much higher. I think it may climb as close to 20%. Why is this important? First and foremost, because tourism is considered a transversal sector in the economy, right? It impacts the economy in three different ways. And here, I'm going to be a little bit academic, so forgive me for it. So it impacts the economy in three different ways: direct, indirect, and induced impacts. The direct impact is, for example, when a tourist arrives at a hotel, they pay for their stay, they pay for their food, they pay the tourism provider. That's a direct impact. Then the tourism provider will need to acquire goods, services, labor to furnish that service to the tourist. That's the indirect impact. And then, most importantly, we have the induced impacts. Because the tourists are visiting an economy, and not just international tourists, but domestic tourists as well, there is more money generated in the economy, and that spurs the whole economic machine. Now, this international tourism is fantastic for Vietnam's balance of trade, right? Because it offsets our import costs. It brings hard currency into our economy, which is very good. But also, it spurs economic growth. And the most connected economic sector to tourism is construction and real estate. So if you ever have the curiosity of having a statistical comparison between real estate development and tourism, you'll see it's almost a parallel line. And I think the average person does not really understand or is aware or is even interested in the economic powerhouse that is tourism, right? It's a lot of money. It's an immense percentage of our economy. Again, officially, it employs, I think it's around 9% of our labor force. In reality, it's probably a lot higher. And if you add elements of the gray economy, you're probably in the 20%. That's 1/5 of Vietnam's economy. And yes, we should care about tourism. It has an enormous impact, not just domestically, but internationally as well. So I'll remind you that a lot of bilateral relationships that Vietnam has established within and outside of ASEAN, they are tourism related, right? And tourism is this enormous industry of peace, and it helps build those relationships with other countries that Vietnam needs.
So maybe moving towards a conclusion, what do you maybe see in the next couple of years or so for sustainable tourism? And I know you mentioned you expect tourism numbers to boom internationally.
Absolutely.
I suppose you mentioned the plastic bag ban in Van Don. What's your outlook for the next couple of years?
I think we'll see a incredibly fast growth of tourism development in Vietnam. I think we will see an explosion, not just in the international market, but in the domestic market as well. We might reach 200 million domestic tourists within the next 5 years. I think we will see sort of an arms race towards human resources. We may have to import some more. And I think we will see sort of a two-tier system within Vietnam. I think you will have destinations at the local and provincial level who will sort of embrace sustainable tourism development. And we've discussed some of those examples during today's conversation. And you will have others who may not be as keen. And there you might have some mass tourism develop. My concern in this is in the fact that we should have a very clearly defined plan for sustainable tourism development. Because again, I cannot reiterate this enough. They are coming. The numbers are undeniable. We will have a momentous growth of tourism in Vietnam, and we should be ready for it.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think that's as good a place as any to stop. I mean, of course, there's more we could explore within this topic, but a good kind of high level view. And yeah, it does seem like, I mean, anecdotally, Vietnam is becoming more popular. Obviously, as we've discussed, some huge concerns, but it is a beautiful place. So I hope it can be harnessed sustainably
Absolutely.
in the future. And anyway, Nuno, thanks again for taking some
Michael,
time.
it was a pleasure. Anytime. Thank you so much for having me on your show.
That's it for this week's episode of the Vietnam Weekly podcast. Connect with the Vietnam Weekly on Threads, LinkedIn, or Instagram. Thank you so much for listening, and please rate or review the show on your preferred podcast platform. See you next week.